Media owners, journalists and others recently convened in the Ethiopian capital, Addis Ababa. Africa 54's Ndimyake Mwakalyelye joins us with details. Ndimi.
Well, thank you, Vincent. Yes, the annual media conference took place in Ethiopia despite calls for organizers to change the venue due to Ethiopia's controversial media practices and laws. A major media conference in Ethiopia's capital, attended by top officials, including the country's prime minister and other African leaders, was an opportunity not to be missed by journalists to ask tough questions. Here's an exchange between Ethiopian journalist TESDALE LEMMA and Ethiopia's Deputy Prime Minister Ndimyake.
When do you think we get a very convincing answer about why these people are put behind you?
The government's act on these specific individuals is not related to their profession.
In 2009, Ethiopia adopted an anti-terrorism law that critics, including media watchdog and human rights groups, say targets journalists. Ethiopia's Communication Affairs Minister REDWAN HUSSEIN says journalists currently serving long sentences in jail broke the law.
No one in this country was behind bar because what he or she wrote on the newspaper or whichever media outlet they are running. It's only because of their attachment with the proscribed entities, which are terrorist groups.
TESDALE LEMMA, who asked the question, says she's not convinced.
The very fact that I asked that question and I started, trembling myself, and I said, oh my God, was it right to do that? What is going to happen to me, The very fact that I felt that way is absolutely telling about the real circumstance of media operation in this country.
Breaking down barriers and facilitating dialogue between journalists and the government is why the organizers of the African Media Leaders Forum say they chose Ethiopia for their 6th annual event. Trevor Ngube of the African Media Initiative, which organizes the forum, says they took Ethiopia's government to task over its restrictive media practices and the plight of the arrested journalists.
We spent 1.5 hours in prison. We were hoping that we would see some of our colleagues in prison, but that did not happen. But for us, what we did is the beginning of winning trust and confidence on both sides.
Ethiopia's Prime Minister HAILEMARIAM told delegates that his government guarantees freedom of expression and is working to improve its relations with the country's journalists.
Since some challenges remain still in the media sector, we have organized a series of consultative forums that aimed, among others, to further enabling environment for the media industry in Ethiopia.
South African professor ANTON HARBER says he applauds the forum organizers' efforts to engage Ethiopia's government, but says they should have pressed for more.
I would have preferred a clearer condemnation and a clearer insistence, not just in dialogue and engagement, but in releasing those prisoners.
African Media Initiative Chief Executive AMADOU says his organization's efforts to improve the continent's media landscape is reaping results.
We know what we want, and we are going to keep working on it, despite the criticism. It's easy to criticize at the end of the day. AMI in 2013, as I referred to my remarks, freed 2 journalists in Burundi and Mali.
Well, for more perspective on Ethiopia's media practices, we now turn to Henok Fente, a reporter with VOA's Horn of Africa service. Thanks so much for joining us today, Henok.
Thank you for having me, Ndimyake.
I know you followed the developments leading up to this forum pretty closely. There were a lot of controversial positions, whether it should be held or not held. What is your take on that, and what is your perspective on Ethiopia's media landscape?
I think events like this are very important to highlight issues of media freedom, and the cases of imprisoned journalists in the continent. And I have really nothing against with the fact that it was held in Ethiopia. Mm-hmm. And what's more important for me is what came out of it. Mm-hmm. If you take a look at some of the pitch that the Ethiopian Prime Minister, as well as Kenyan Vice President William Ruto were saying, mm-hmm. Pretty much they were selling the case for state-run media throughout Africa. Mm-hmm. And consistently they said that there's an African voice and we need to hear Africa's voice. Right. I don't even know what that means.
But now what about specifically with relation to Ethiopia and some of the controversies, some of the controversial revelations, including these 7 journalists who are arrested because of supposedly violating the country's anti-terrorism laws? If, say, Africa had its own media, as what is being advocated, what would these stories be like?
Well, I think the leaders are pitching Africa to speak in one voice, and that is not the basis for press freedom. We need to have plurality of opinions, and as you know, as Africans, even for history that happened 100 years ago, we cannot agree on a fact if you bring 4 African historians to agree on something that happened in the past, let alone in the present. So what is really important here is Africa needs difference of opinions. Africa needs different voices, and that's what the leaders need to recognize.
The case specifically to do with Ethiopia, the fact that the country's prime minister, the deputy prime minister, and some other high-level senior officials in the government were present, the exchange with that journalist, I mean, does that show some kind of change in the future, that there's opening of space? You've
heard what LEMMA said, what was going through her head in your previous piece. She was worried for her, you know, what the repercussion is going to be in Ethiopia.
After the fact.
Nothing happened to her, but during, while the meeting was taking place, 2 journalists from MAHTAR newspaper, which is a weekly newspaper being published in Ethiopia, and 1 National Geographic photographer were arrested in Ethiopia. So this tells you about the current situation in the country.
What do you think in terms of going forth? What the Prime Minister said he was planning to do, consultations with journalists, opening up the space, allowing freedom of expression as is already guaranteed in the Constitution. Is that something that maybe a forum like what happened will help to make real, a reality?
I'm optimistic, and I hope the Prime Minister means what he says, and that his administration would open some room a little bit for journalists to do their jobs, which is just reporting the facts as they know them. And if the Prime Minister really does that, it's wonderful news. But the current situation in the country doesn't show that.
What can you tell us a little bit more about these 7 journalists who have been arrested? Some of them serving upwards of 20 years, 18?
Well, by the time the 3 of them, especially Skindar Nagga, Riot Alemu, and Wubshet Taya, are released, a baby born today would be 34 years. So that's the length of their sentence. And these are really long sentences. A friend of mine, I was talking to a friend of mine, and I said, 34 years. And he said, what did they do? Did they murder someone? All they've done, according to CPJ and international organizations like RSF and Human Rights Watch, what these journalists have done is just doing their job as reporters. And what we have in the country is, of course, if, be it a doctor or a reporter, is indicted for terrorism charges, well, do we have independent institutions like courts who do that? And that's the question that Ethiopian leaders need to answer.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Henok
you.
Fente, we'll be having this discussion for more shows, I'm sure. Henok Fente is a reporter with VOA's Horn of Africa service.